The gentle lapping of waves against the harbor, the cry of gulls overhead, the scent of salt and sea. These are the things that should define the sleepy fishing town of Port Blossom. But beneath the idyllic surface, a current of unimaginable darkness is about to drag this community into a nightmare from which it may never awaken. What you are about to hear is a story of innocence lost, of a town gripped by fear, and of the relentless pursuit of a monster who walks among them. We delve into a case so chilling, it will make you question the very nature of evil. Before we cast our line into these murky waters, if you're a fan of true crime, mysteries that keep you on the edge of your seat, and stories that explore the darkest corners of the human psyche, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single clue in the harrowing investigation that follows. Now, settle in and prepare for a tale that begins with a grotesque discovery and ends in a desperate race against time. This is the story of the Fisherman of Souls and the 10 young lives he so brutally stole. The dawn broke over Port Blossom with a deceptive painter's grace, splashing hues of soft pink and brilliant orange across the placid surface of the Atlantic. It was a Tuesday, the kind of morning that promised routine and the simple, hard-working life the town was known for. For Silas Salty Croft, a fisherman whose face was a roadmap of 60 years at sea, it was just another day to wrestle a living from the ocean's depths. His trawler, the Sea Serpent, chugged out of the harbor, its diesel engine a familiar, rhythmic heartbeat against the quiet dawn. The air was crisp, filled with the briny perfume of the low tide and the promise of a good haul. Silas had his lines in the water before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The rhythm of the work was as ingrained in him as the lines on his palms. Cast, wait, haul. It was a meditation, a dance he'd performed thousands of times. An hour into his work, he felt a familiar, heavy tug on one of his deep-sea lines. This was different from the frantic thrashing of a bluefin or the stubborn dead weight of a snagged rock. This was a deep, ponderous weight, a sign of a truly monumental catch. A grin split his weathered face. This could be the one to make his week a giant bluefin tuna, the kind that fetched a handsome price at the market. He engaged the powerful winch, the thick line groaning under the strain as it was slowly, painstakingly reeled in. The fight was immense, testing the limits of his equipment. Silas's heart hammered in his chest with a mixture of excitement and exertion. 10 minutes turned into 20, then 30. Sweat beaded on his brow, mingling with the sea spray. Finally, he saw a colossal shape breaking the surface, its silvery blue scales shimmering in the morning light. It was a tuna, all right, and a monster at that. Easily over 600 pounds, maybe more. This was the catch of a lifetime. With a final, Herculean effort, he and his young deckhand, a lad named Finn, managed to haul the behemoth onto the deck. The fish was magnificent, a testament to the power and bounty of the ocean. It was only as they prepared to gut and ice their prize that the first inkling of wrongness crept in. The fish's belly was unnaturally distended, grotesquely swollen in a way that suggested something other than a recent hearty meal. "Something's not right with this one, Salty," Finn said, his young face a mask of confusion. "Never seen one so bloated." Silas grunted in agreement, his initial elation souring into a knot of unease. He grabbed a long, razor-sharp filleting knife. With the practiced skill of a lifetime, he made a long, deep incision along the fish's underside. The stench that erupted was immediate and overwhelming, a gag-inducing miasma of decay and something else, something sickeningly sweet and utterly alien to the sea. It wasn't the smell of rotten fish. It was the smell of death on a human scale. Finn recoiled, his hand flying to cover his mouth and nose. Silas, made of sterner stuff, pressed on, widening the incision. And then he saw it. Nestled within the bloody, cavernous gut of the giant tuna, amidst the half-digested mackerel and squid, was a small, pale form. It took his sea-addled brain a moment to process the impossible sight. It was a human foot, small, perfectly formed, and attached to a leg. A wave of nausea and horror washed over Silas, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He stumbled back, the bloody knife clattering to the deck. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of the macabre discovery. He had heard tales, old sea dog yarns about strange things found in the bellies of sharks. But this was a tuna, and this was no stray limb. This was a child. With trembling hands, Silas forced himself to look closer, to widen the opening further. The full, horrific tableau was revealed. Curled in the fetal position, packed tightly within the fish's stomach, was the complete body of a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. His skin was pale and waxy, his hair a dark mat against his small skull. His eyes were closed, as if in a peaceful, eternal sleep, a stark and terrible contrast to the grotesque nature of his tomb. The idyllic morning had shattered into a million pieces. The rising sun now seemed to cast a sickly, accusatory glare upon the deck of the Sea Serpent. The gentle lapping of the waves sounded like a mournful dirge. Silas Croft, a man who had faced down the fury of the ocean his entire life, felt a fear colder and deeper than any winter storm. He fumbled for his radio, his voice, when he finally found it, a choked, trembling whisper that crackled over the airwaves to the Port Blossom Coast Guard. "Mayday! Mayday! We've found a body. Inside a fish. Dear God, it's a child." The call sent a shockwave through the small, tight-knit community of Port Blossom. News of the gruesome discovery spread like wildfire, carried on hushed whispers from the docks to the town square, from the local diner to the front porches of every home. A child found inside a fish. It was the stuff of nightmares, a horror so surreal and barbaric that the town's collective consciousness struggled to comprehend it. By the time the Sea Serpent was escorted back to the harbor by the Coast Guard, the docks were swarming with a grim audience of state troopers, local police, and grim-faced FBI agents who had been scrambled from the nearest field office. The lead investigator was a man named Detective Miles Corbin, a veteran of the state's homicide division. Corbin was a tall, weary-looking man in his late 40s, with tired eyes that had seen too much of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of society. His face was a stoic mask, but the slight tightening of his jaw as he looked upon the scene on Silas's boat betrayed the horror he felt. His partner, a younger, sharper-edged FBI agent named Isabella Rossi, stood beside him. Rossi was a profiler, a woman who dealt in the currency of twisted minds. Her gaze was intense, analytical, as she surveyed the scene, her mind already racing, sifting through the details, trying to find the first threads of the monstrous tapestry that had been laid before them. The medical examiner, Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman with a calm and professional demeanor that belied the grim nature of her work, confirmed their worst fears. The boy had not drowned. There was no water in his lungs. The cause of death was asphyxiation. He had been suffocated before being placed inside the fish. And then she delivered the second, even more chilling piece of information. There were faint ligature marks on his wrists and ankles. He had been bound. This was no tragic accident. This was murder, a deliberate, calculated, and monstrous act. The investigation began with a frantic urgency. The first priority was to identify the victim. His face was broadcast on every local news channel. His description circulated to every police department in the state. The call that came a few hours later was the one every officer dreads. A tearful, hysterical mother from a neighboring town, a town over 50 miles away, identified the boy as her son, Leo, who had vanished from a local park 2 days earlier. He had been playing on the swings one moment and the next he was gone. The news sent a fresh wave of terror through the region. This wasn't a local crime. The killer was mobile, and their hunting ground was far larger than anyone had initially feared. As the detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a string of similar disappearances, a trail of missing children from towns and cities up and down the coast, stretching back for months. All of them young, all of them vanishing without a trace. A sickening realization began to dawn upon Corbin and Rossi. This wasn't the killer's first victim. It was just the first one they had found. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. The investigators worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine and a grim determination. They set up a task force, pulling in resources from multiple agencies. They interviewed Silas and Finn, going over every detail of their discovery. They analyzed ocean currents, trying to determine where the tuna might have been when it ingested the boy. But the Atlantic was a vast and unforgiving wilderness, and the fish could have traveled hundreds of miles. Rossi, the profiler, began to build a picture of the killer, a shadowy figure she dubbed the fisherman. "This is not a crime of passion," she explained to the task force, her voice low and steady. "The planning, the precision, the sheer audacity of it. This is the work of a highly organized and intelligent psychopath. He's meticulous. He chooses his victims carefully. He leaves no evidence at the scene of the abduction. The use of the fish, that's his signature, is a symbolic act. He's not just disposing of the bodies. He's desecrating them, turning the ocean, a symbol of life and nature, into a graveyard." Her words hung heavy in the air, painting a terrifying portrait of the monster they were hunting. He was a ghost, a phantom who moved through their communities unseen, plucking children from their lives with a chilling efficiency. The media descended upon Port Blossom, turning the once quiet town into a circus of satellite trucks and reporters. The story of the boy in the fish made national headlines, and the pressure on the investigators mounted with each passing hour. Then, a week after the discovery of Leo, the nightmare repeated itself. Another fisherman, this time 100 miles south, pulled in a massive grouper. And inside, another child. A young girl, this time. Like Leo, she had been suffocated, bound, and placed inside the fish. She was another missing child from a town even further inland. The fisherman had struck again. The discovery of the second victim sent a new wave of panic rippling across the country. The pattern was now undeniable. A serial killer was at work, a predator of the most depraved kind, who used the vast, untamable ocean as his personal dumping ground. The two discoveries, so far apart, only deepened the mystery. How was he doing it? How was he getting the bodies inside these massive fish? The logistics were mind-boggling. It would require immense strength, specialized knowledge, and access to the ocean in a way that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Corbin and Rossi found themselves chasing a phantom. They had no witnesses, no forensic evidence from the abduction sites, and no clear geographical pattern to the disappearances. The fisherman was a ghost, leaving only a trail of unimaginable grief and a series of grotesque, aquatic graves. As the second week of the investigation began, a new lead emerged, a small, flickering candle in the suffocating darkness of the case. A marine biologist, an expert on the migratory patterns of large game fish, contacted the task force. He had been following the case and had a theory. The two fish that had been caught, the tuna and the grouper, were both apex predators, but they inhabited different depths and temperature zones. For them to be in the same general area suggested a specific and unusual oceanographic phenomenon. A deep-water upwelling, where nutrient-rich cold water rises to the surface, attracting a massive amount of marine life. These upwellings were rare and localized. If they could pinpoint where one had occurred recently, it might give them a much smaller, more manageable search area. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. Using satellite data and oceanographic charts, the team identified a recent upwelling event that had taken place off a remote, uninhabited stretch of coastline, a rugged and desolate place known as the Graveyard of Ships, notorious for its treacherous currents and rocky shores. It was a place where few people ever ventured, a place where a man could work undisturbed, a place where the darkest of secrets could be hidden beneath the churning, gray waves of the Atlantic. Corbin and Rossi knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were getting closer. They were heading into the heart of the fisherman's territory. But they also knew that they were not just hunting a killer. They were racing against time, praying that they could find him before he chose his next victim, before another child was lost to the cold, silent depths of the ocean. The hunt was on, and the stakes could not be higher. The quiet town of Port Blossom had become the epicenter of a nightmare, and the whole world was watching, waiting, and praying for a miracle. The Graveyard of Ships was a name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence by the old salts who plied the coastal waters. It was a jagged, 30-mile stretch of coastline where the continental shelf dropped away abruptly, creating a maelstrom of unpredictable currents and submerged, ship-shredding reefs. The shore was a desolate landscape of black, volcanic rock and gnarled, salt-blasted cypress trees, a place that seemed to have been carved by a malevolent god. It was perpetually shrouded in a clammy, gray mist that clung to the cliffs and deadened all sound save for the eternal, mournful roar of the surf. This was where the data pointed, to this forsaken corner of the world, and it was here that the hunt for the fishermen would take a terrifying new turn. Corbin and Rossi arrived by helicopter, the thumping of the rotor blades a jarring, mechanical intrusion into the primeval silence of the place. They were accompanied by a small, hand-picked team of FBI agents and state troopers, all grim-faced and heavily armed. As they descended towards a small, makeshift landing zone on a bluff overlooking the churning sea, Corbin felt a knot of cold dread tighten in his stomach. This was the kind of place where nightmares were born, a place where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead felt terrifyingly thin. Rossi, ever the pragmatist, was already scanning the coastline with a pair of high-powered binoculars, her mind a whirring engine of logic and deduction. "He'd need a base of operations," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "Somewhere secluded with deep water access. A place where he could bring the victims and prepare them without fear of discovery." Their initial search of the coastline proved fruitless. The terrain was brutal and unforgiving, a labyrinth of treacherous cliffs and hidden coves. They found nothing but the skeletal remains of old shipwrecks, their timbers bleached white by the sun and salt, and the ever-present, keening cry of the gulls. The day wore on, the mist thickening into a damp, chilling shroud, and with it, a sense of hopelessness began to creep into the team. They were chasing a ghost in his own private hell. It was a young state trooper who made the discovery. He had been scrambling over a ridge of black rock when he slipped, his foot plunging into a hidden crevice. As he pulled himself up, he noticed something odd. A length of thick, industrial-grade steel cable, almost completely hidden by a tangle of seaweed and scrub brush. It was out of place, a piece of modern artifice in this raw, natural landscape. Following the cable, they found it led to a heavy, rusted steel plate, cunningly concealed beneath a flat-topped boulder. It took 4 men to pry it open, revealing a dark, yawning hole that plunged into the earth. A ladder, slick with algae and sea slime, descended into the darkness. Corbin and Rossi exchanged a look. This was it, the heart of the beast's lair. With their weapons drawn and flashlights cutting bright, nervous beams into the oppressive blackness, they began their descent. The air grew cold and heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else, the faint, coppery tang of old blood. The ladder ended on a narrow, stone-hewn ledge. They were in a sea cave, a vast, subterranean grotto carved by millennia of relentless waves. The only light came from their flashlights, their beams dancing across the slick, wet walls and the deep, inky black water that filled the bottom of the cave. In the center of the subterranean lake, a small, rocky island rose from the depths, and on that island was a scene of such calculated, clinical horror that it would be forever seared into the minds of all who witnessed it. It was a makeshift laboratory, a butcher's workshop. A heavy, stainless steel table stood in the center of the island, stained with dark, dried blood. On a nearby workbench, an array of surgical instruments, knives of every conceivable size and shape, and heavy-duty fishing gear were laid out with a chilling precision. There were spools of thick, monofilament line, heavy-duty hooks, and a collection of custom-made, weighted harnesses. But it was the centerpiece of this macabre workshop that drew their horrified gazes. A large, industrial-sized freezer hummed softly in the corner, its white enamel surface a stark, clean contrast to the grime and filth of the cave. With a shared, unspoken dread, Corbin opened the freezer. A cloud of icy vapor billowed out, and inside, they found them. The missing children, 8 of them, perfectly preserved, their small bodies frozen solid, their faces peaceful, almost angelic in their icy slumber. They were laid out in a neat, orderly row, each one tagged with a small, laminated card bearing their name, age, and the date of their abduction. It was a gruesome, meticulous catalog of death. Rossi, her professional composure finally cracking, turned away, her hand covering her mouth as she fought back a wave of nausea. Corbin, his face a mask of cold, hard fury, stared into the freezer, his mind reeling. The fisherman wasn't just killing them. He was collecting them. He was preserving them like trophies. The discovery of the cave and its horrific contents was a major breakthrough, but it also plunged the investigators into a deeper, more disturbing mystery. They had found the killer's workshop, but the killer himself was gone. He had vanished, leaving behind only the heartbreaking evidence of his depravity. The search of the cave yielded a treasure trove of forensic evidence. Fingerprints, DNA, fibers, a wealth of clues that would finally give them a tangible link to their phantom. But it was a single, innocuous-looking object found on the workbench that would prove to be the key to unlocking the killer's identity. A small, tarnished silver locket, the kind a child might wear. Inside the locket was a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young girl with a sad, wistful smile. On the back, a tiny inscription was barely legible. "My little starfish, forever in the deep." The locket was a ghost from the past, a clue that suggested the fisherman's motivations might be rooted in a tragedy long since buried. While the forensic team meticulously processed the cave, Corbin and Rossi focused on the locket. They ran the inscription through every database they could think of, cross-referencing it with old news articles, police reports, and public records. For days, they hit nothing but dead ends. The locket was a ghost, a whisper from a past that refused to give up its secrets. Meanwhile, the news of the discovery of the 8 children sent a fresh wave of grief and outrage across the nation. The fisherman was no longer just a shadowy figure from a news report. He was a tangible monster, a real-life boogeyman who had turned a hidden sea cave into a personal morgue. The pressure on the task force intensified, the clamor for justice growing louder with each passing day. It was Rossi, poring over microfiche records of old local newspapers in a dusty, forgotten corner of the county archives, who finally found the connection. An article from over 30 years ago, from a small, now-defunct local paper. It told the tragic story of a local fisherman, a man named Thomas Abernathy, whose 7-year-old daughter, Lily, had been tragically swept off the town pier during a violent storm and her body never recovered. The article was accompanied by a faded photograph of the grieving father, a man with haunted, hollow eyes. And around his neck, he wore a simple silver locket. The article quoted him, his words a heartbreaking lament. "She was my little starfish. The sea took her from me, and now she's forever in the deep." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Thomas Abernathy, a man who had suffered an unimaginable loss, a man whose grief had been left to fester, to curdle into something monstrous and unrecognizable. They dug into Abernathy's life. He had been a marine biologist, a brilliant but reclusive man who had become a fisherman after his daughter's death. He owned a secluded property that backed onto the graveyard of ships. He had the knowledge, the skills, and the access to the ocean. He was the fisherman. But knowing who he was and finding him were two very different things. Abernathy had disappeared. His house was empty, his boat gone. He had known they were coming. He had vanished back into the shadows, a ghost in his own twisted narrative. The manhunt for Thomas Abernathy became the biggest in the state's history. His face was everywhere, his name on the lips of every news anchor. The task force, now armed with a name and a face, redoubled their efforts. They tracked his financials, his known associates, his last known movements. But Abernathy was a ghost. He lived off the grid, a man who had long since divorced himself from the modern world. As the search for Abernathy intensified, Rossi delved deeper into his past, trying to understand the psychological labyrinth of his mind. She spoke to old friends, former colleagues, anyone who had known him before the tragedy that had shattered his life. A picture emerged of a man obsessed with the ocean, a man who saw it as both a source of life and a cruel, capricious god that had stolen his only child. "He's not just killing these children," Rossi explained to Corbin, her voice filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. He's He's creating a new family. In his twisted, grief-shattered mind, he's reuniting them with his own lost daughter. He's preserving them, keeping them safe from the world that he believes is cruel and dangerous. And the fish are the vessels, the messengers. He's sending his children back to the sea, back to where his daughter is. It's a ritual, a grotesque, symbolic act of love and madness. Her words painted a chilling, almost sympathetic portrait of the monster they were hunting. Abernathy was not just a cold-blooded killer. He was a man driven by a grief so profound, so all-consuming, that it had shattered his sanity and turned him into a predator. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An old, retired fisherman who had known Abernathy for years contacted the hotline. He remembered Abernathy talking about a secret place, a place he called his sanctuary, a remote, uninhabited island, a small speck of land far off the coast, a place that was not on any official maps. The old fisherman gave them the coordinates, a set of numbers scribbled on a faded, salt-stained napkin. It was a desperate, last-ditch gamble. The island was in the middle of a notoriously treacherous stretch of ocean, a place where storms could brew up without warning. But it was their only lead. Corbin and Rossi knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that Abernathy was there. He had retreated to his final, secret sanctuary, and they knew, with an even greater sense of dread, that he was not alone. The day before Abernathy disappeared, another child had been reported missing. 10-year-old boy. The fisherman had his final victim. The race was on, a desperate, high-stakes dash across the storm-tossed Atlantic to save one last innocent life from the clutches of a man who had lost his soul to the sea. The final act of this tragedy was about to be played out on a lonely, forgotten island, and the cost of failure was a price too terrible to contemplate. The storm hit them with the sudden, unbridled fury of a cornered animal. One moment, the sea was a churning, gray expanse under a leaden sky. The next, it was a liquid mountain range, a chaotic, frothing maelstrom of wind and water. The Coast Guard cutter, a vessel built to withstand the worst the Atlantic could throw at it, was tossed about like a child's toy. Rain, driven horizontally by gale-force winds, lashed the windows of the bridge, and the world outside was a terrifying, monochrome blur of gray. Detective Miles Corbin stood on the bridge, his knuckles white as he gripped a steel handrail, his gaze fixed on the raging sea. Beside him, Agent Isabella Rossi, her face pale but her eyes resolute, monitored the radar, her voice a calm, steady presence amidst the chaos. They were in a race against a storm and against a madman. The coordinates the old fisherman had given them pointed to a speck of land so small it was barely a rumor, a place called Isle of Tears, a name that now seemed like a chillingly prescient omen. "We're getting close," the cutter's captain yelled over the roar of the storm. "But the island is surrounded by reefs. Getting ashore in this maelstrom is going to be damn near impossible." Corbin's jaw was set like granite. "We don't have a choice," he yelled back. "There's a child on that island. We're going in." The final approach to the Isle of Tears was a heart-stopping, white-knuckle ride. The captain, a man with salt water in his veins, skillfully navigated the treacherous reefs, his face a mask of intense concentration. The island emerged from the mist and rain like a jagged, black tooth, a place of sheer cliffs and stunted, wind-tormented trees. There was a small, sheltered cove on the leeward side of the island, a sliver of calm in the midst of the tempest. It was their only chance. A small, inflatable Zodiac was launched into the churning water, and Corbin, Rossi, and a team of 4 heavily armed SWAT officers piled in. The short journey from the cutter to the shore was a brutal, bone-jarring ordeal. Waves crashed over the small boat, drenching them in icy, stinging salt water. But they made it, scrambling onto a narrow, black sand beach, the storm raging around them like a living, breathing monster. The island was even more desolate and forbidding up close. A narrow, treacherous-looking path wound its way up the cliff face, disappearing into the mist. With their weapons at the ready, they began their ascent. The wind tore at them, threatening to rip them from their precarious handholds. Every step was a gamble, a test of will against the fury of the elements. Near the summit of the cliff they found it. A small, crudely built cabin, nestled in a small grove of cypress trees, its windows dark and lifeless. This was Abernathy's sanctuary, his final refuge. They approached the cabin with tactical precision, their movements swift and silent, their senses on a knife's edge. Corbin gave the signal, and the SWAT team breached the door with a thunderous crash. The scene inside was one of quiet, ordered insanity. The cabin was a single room, meticulously clean and organized. Books on marine biology and oceanography lined the walls. Charts of ocean currents were pinned to a large corkboard. In the center of the room, a small wood-burning stove cast a warm, flickering glow. And sitting in a simple wooden chair, staring out at the storm-tossed sea, was Thomas Abernathy. He was a thin, wiry man with a wild, gray beard and eyes that burned with a strange, feverish intensity. He didn't seem surprised to see them. He looked at them with a kind of weary resignation, as if he had been expecting them all along. He was not the raging monster they had imagined, but something far more unsettling. A man who had retreated so far into his own private world of grief and madness that the outside world no longer seemed to touch him. "You're too late," he said, his voice a soft, raspy whisper. "He's with her now. They're safe. Forever." Rossi's heart froze. "The boy, Abernathy?" she demanded, her voice sharp with urgency. "Where is he?" Abernathy smiled, a sad, gentle smile that did not reach his haunted eyes. "He's with Lily," he repeated. "I sent him back to the sea, back to the deep. He's with my little starfish now." A cold, sickening dread washed over Corbin. He scanned the cabin, his eyes finally landing on a large, open wooden crate near the door. Inside was a tangle of ropes, heavy-duty fishing hooks, and a small, child-sized life vest. Abernathy hadn't used a fish this time. He had run out of time. He had simply given the boy to the sea. But then, a faint sound, almost lost in the howl of the wind, reached their ears. A small, muffled cry. It came from a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden beneath a bearskin rug. A SWAT officer yanked the rug aside, pried open the trapdoor, and there, in a small, dark cellar, they found him. The boy. He was bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror, but he was alive. The relief that washed over the room was a palpable, physical force. They had made it. They had saved him. As the SWAT officers comforted the terrified child, Corbin and Rossi turned their attention back to Abernathy. He seemed unfazed by the discovery of the boy, his mind still lost in its own delusional world. "The sea is a jealous mother," he whispered, his gaze once again fixed on the raging storm outside. "She takes the ones we love, but she also keeps them safe. I was just sending them home. I was making a new family for my Lily, in the only place she can be." Rossi, her voice soft with a mixture of pity and revulsion, tried to reason with him. "Thomas," she said, "your daughter is gone. You can't bring her back. You've caused so much pain, so much suffering." Abernathy looked at her then, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of lucidity, of immense, bottomless sorrow, crossed his face. "I know," he whispered, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. But the silence was too much to bear. In that moment he was no longer a monster, a boogeyman. He was a man, a father, broken by a grief so immense it had shattered his world and turned him into the very thing he had once loved and respected. A cold, merciless predator. The storm began to break as they led Abernathy from the cabin. The wind died down, the rain softened to a drizzle, and a sliver of pale, watery sunlight broke through the clouds. It was as if the island itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The journey back to the mainland was a quiet, somber affair. The rescued boy, wrapped in a warm blanket, was safe. The monster was in chains. The case of the fisherman was over. The trial of Thomas Abernathy was a national media sensation. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating serial killer. The defense argued that he was a man driven mad by grief, a victim of a tragedy that had shattered his psyche. In the end, the jury found him guilty but mentally ill. He was sentenced to life in a secure psychiatric facility, destined to live out his days in a world of his own making, forever lost in the deep, dark ocean of his own sorrow. For Corbin and Rossi, the case left an indelible scar. They had hunted a monster, but they had found a man. A man whose story was a tragic, cautionary tale about the destructive power of grief and the fine, fragile line between love and madness. Months later, Corbin stood on the pier in Port Blossom, the same pier where Lily Abernathy had been swept away all those years ago. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. The sea was calm, its surface a mirror of the peaceful sky. He thought of the 10 young lives that had been so brutally cut short, and of the man who had taken them. He thought of the families, forever shattered by a loss they would never truly understand. He had brought justice to them, but it felt like a hollow victory. There was no real closure, no way to truly mend the broken hearts and shattered lives the fisherman had left in his wake. There was only the quiet, mournful cry of the gulls, and the endless, eternal sigh of the sea that gives, and the sea that takes away, and the dark, unfathomable secrets it keeps, forever hidden in the deep. He thought of the families, forever shattered by a loss they would never truly understand. He had brought justice to them, but it felt like a hollow victory. There was no real closure, no way to truly mend the broken hearts and shattered lives the fisherman had left in his wake. There was only the quiet, mournful cry of the gulls, and the endless, eternal sigh of the sea that gives, and the sea that takes away, and the dark, unfathomable secrets it keeps, forever hidden in the deep.